The Civil War Battle of Franklin. What led to the conflict of the Battle of Franklin was during the American Civil War when the Union Army, or the North Army, led by General William Sherman, conquers Atlanta. He starts his east march to sea. After this, the Confederate Army, or the South Army, led by General John Bell Hood out of Georgia into Nashville, Tennessee, aiming to lure Sherman into a pointless pursuit before heading to Kentucky and joining soldiers in Virginia with a humongous supply of food. During this time, the Union Army on the Confederate Army's tail are on a race to get to Nashville. The Union Army rear guard, led by General John Schofield, was determined to conquer the Confederates in Nashville during their journey. Schofield engages in a few minor battles with John Bell Hood's army. Realizing that the Union Army was getting too close for comfort, Hood decides to attack the opposing army. Hood, knowing that the army was not able to make it to Nashville without getting captured, decides to engage combat in Franklin. The conflict is when the Union Army was determined to conquer the Confederates in Nashville, while the Confederates wanted to win back Nashville and get out of the losing position.
That started the Battle of Franklin and the compromise that ended the Battle of Franklin.
So are we talking in the context of the whole Civil War or this campaign specifically?
This campaign.
This campaign specifically. So what had happened leading up to this campaign is that the Union Army, led by General William Sherman, had taken over Atlanta just a few months before this. And the Confederate Army of Tennessee had been defending Atlanta. When their forces were overwhelmed, they withdrew and started heading west towards the Mississippi, trying to draw Sherman away to chase them. But instead, Sherman begins his march to the sea, heading east through Georgia into the Carolinas. So once that happens, Hood decides he's going to march north and try to take back Nashville for the Confederacy. Now, Sherman, rather than chase Hood with his full force, just splits off a small portion of his army under Schofield to get back here and defend the city. So that's what's happening as Hood is marching towards Nashville. Schofield gets in front of him to slow his advance. They fight the battle here at Franklin. Schofield holds off Hood's forces here, inflicts significant damage, and then withdraws to Nashville to defend the city. And 2 weeks after this battle is when the Union Army decisively destroys the Confederate force at Nashville. And they chase them all the way out of Tennessee. And so that's what ends this campaign here. And this campaign would really be a big factor in the end of the Civil War. This was the last major Confederate offensive. Just a few months after this campaign finishes is when the Confederate Army surrenders at Appomattox and the Civil War ends.
What did they eat normally during this battle?
They were eating, on the Confederate side, mostly at this point, just something called hardtack, which is literally just flour and water mixed together. They would have had a little meat. The armies would have maybe like cattle traveling with them and whatever they could forage from the land. But, it's late November at this point. There's not a lot of crops growing available that you could eat. So they're really subsisting mostly on a diet of just flour and water. And even that they don't have enough of. They're on very low rations at this point.
How long did this battle last?
This battle took just 5 hours. So the attack begins at 4 o'clock. It's over by 9 p.m.
Who won the Battle of Franklin?
The Union Army won this battle. They were trying to just hold off the Confederates. They do that. They inflict 3 times as many casualties on the Confederates as they take, and then they're able to pull back and defend the city afterwards.
Can you give us a rough estimate of how many men died during this battle?
Best estimate is about 2,000 men who died in this battle. Maybe 1,600 or so on the Confederate side and a few hundred on the Union side.
Do you think this battle is one people should know about?
Absolutely. I think it's one that has not gotten a lot of attention until recently, but it really, as I said, it's one of the last major battles of the war, and it really was the last major offensive on the Confederate side, their last big chance to change the course of the war.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Already at a disadvantage with less numbers and people, the Confederate Army needed a big win if they wanted any hope of not being defeated in the war. What led to the compromise of the Battle of Franklin was when they discovered it was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. On November 30th, 1864, General John Bell Hood of the Confederate side led the charge at dawn against the Union in Franklin. The death toll during the Battle of Franklin was rising tremendously near the end. The Union Army had already established that they had won with deaths of about 189, 1,033 wounded, and 1,104 missing and captured, while the Confederate Army had about 1,750 dead, 3,800 wounded, and 702 missing and captured. Already at the disadvantage with less numbers and people, the Confederate Army needed a big win if they wanted any hope of not being defeated in the war. The compromise was when both armies agreed that they should settle the rest of the battle in Nashville. They decided this because both armies had come to the conclusion that they needed to take a few days to heal the wounded and bury the dead. This is the compromise of the Battle of Franklin. The Carton House is one of the two houses on the Battle of Franklin battleground. It was built in 1826 by the former Nashville mayor, Randall McGavock, and his family. Their family on the day of the Battle of Franklin, November 30th, 1864, consisted of John McGavock, Randall's son, Elizabeth, his wife, Hattie, who was only 9, and Winder, who was 7. On the day of the battle, hundreds of the Confederate wounded were brought here to be taken care of and healed. To this day, you can still see some of the bloodstains on the hardwood floor in the bedroom. Most of the wounded soldiers brought there were no older than 18 and locked up to Elizabeth as a mother figure at that time. Years after the battle, soldiers that survived kept in touch with the McGavock family, saying that they needed most was a mother then, and that they will never forget how much she helped that day. Even Hattie, only being 9, was like a sister to the soldiers. The Carter House was another house on the Battle of Franklin site. It was the opposite of the Carton House. Instead of tending to the wounded soldiers, the family aimed to protect themselves during the battle. Thomas Carter, the owner's son, was brutally shot just 5 feet away from his home. He was then taken back to his house where he died 2 days later. This is all about the Carter House. Cemetery. The cemetery is a landmark in the middle of the Battle of Franklin battleground. It's home to over 1,500 Confederate soldiers who died in the Battle of Franklin. It has each column organized by states and how many died from each state. Some of the soldiers don't have their name on their grave, which meant they had no way to identify themselves. The cemetery is an important part of the national landmark and will be visited for years to come.